As the bell tolled, signaling the death knell, the condemned man's heart raced. His breaths grew shallow, mirroring the rising panic in the crowd. Decapitation, the ultimate punishment, the most terrifying spectacle of all. The axe gleamed in the morning sun, a promise of swift oblivion. Yet for the onlookers, the true horror was in the anticipation, the drawn-out agony before the final merciful release. They had come to watch, to learn, and perhaps to be warned. This was no ordinary event. This was an execution. The medieval period, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, was a time of great upheaval and transformation in European history. Feudalism was the dominant social system, and the king's power was considered divinely ordained. During this era, the concept of human rights was virtually non-existent, and the rule of law was often arbitrary and brutal. Life in the Middle Ages was hard and short, and death, when it came, was a spectacle. Amongst the various forms of capital punishment practiced during the Middle Ages, beheading stood out as the most prominent and feared. In many ways, it was the ultimate punishment. It was public, it was swift, and it was seen as a punishment fit for the most heinous of crimes. The method varied, but typically a skilled executioner would use a large axe or sword to take the head off the shoulders of the condemned. For the condemned, the experience was quick, though undoubtedly painful. However, for those watching, the beheading was anything but. It was a public display of power, a reminder to all who gathered to watch that the authority was absolute and merciless. As the executioner approached his victim, the crowd would have been on the edge of their seats, so to speak, witnessing the imminent end of another human being. They had come to see justice being served, and they were not disappointed. The sight of blood, while shocking to our modern sensibilities, was not considered gruesome in the medieval period. Rather, it was a stark reminder of the fragility of life itself. Seeing another person beheaded was a sobering experience that drove home the message that one wrong move or one accusation could change your fate in an instant. It was a warning to the community and a deterrent to potential lawbreakers. However, there was more to these public executions than just justice and deterrence. They were also a form of entertainment. While the word might seem at odds with the brutality of the axe, consider the context of the time. There were no movies, no television, and certainly no internet or smartphones. Public events like executions were the primary source of news and entertainment. For many people living in the Middle Ages, these events drew crowds of people from neighboring villages. It was a communal experience that brought people together, in a sense. It was a form of community building through shared horror. But as the executioner wiped the axe clean and the crowd dispersed, the true cost of this entertainment became clear. The spectacle was over, but its impact on the community was profound. The risk of being accused of a crime, no matter how grave or petty, loomed large in people's minds. The executioner's axe became a symbol of this ever-present danger. Every swing of the axe not only took a life, but chipped away at the sense of security that people felt in their communities. In the grim theater of medieval justice, the condemned were often given a choice between two terrible fates. While beheading was reserved for the nobility and those accused of the most heinous crimes, slower, more agonizing death awaited others. Burning at the stake was a punishment both excruciating and humiliating. It was a public spectacle designed not just to punish the individual, but to send a message to the entire community. As the fire slowly consumed the condemned, the crowd watched intently, morbidly fascinated by the unfolding horror. The smell of burning flesh mingled with the smoke and wood, creating a stench that would linger long after the ordeal was over. The idea behind this form of capital punishment was to burn the accused slowly, ensuring that they suffered as much as possible before death finally came. Sometimes the fire was made to last for hours, and the condemned were left to writhe in agony as their bodies were burnt and charred. In some cases, the victims were tied to stakes placed precariously over pits filled with oil or resin, which were then set ablaze. Such executions were not only physically agonizing, but psychologically terrifying. To be burned at the stake was to die in front of one's community, stripped of one's dignity and reduced to ashes. It was a fate worse than death, or so they believed. While it may seem barbaric and cruel by today's standards, it's important to remember that this was the context of the times. Medieval society was vastly different from ours, and the concepts of human rights and due process were not as established. The punishment had to be severe to deter people from breaking the law, and what could be more severe than a death that was both agonizing and public? Do you think medieval executions were too brutal? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Also, like and share if you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching. Welcome back to my channel. Today, we're continuing our exploration of the brutal realities of the Middle Ages. If you're new here, consider subscribing to be notified of our next release. In the dark heart of medieval society, the executioner was both feared and revered. His tools were not mere instruments of death, but symbols of his power over life itself. But the grim reality was that the executioner's role was not one of honor, as modern society might think. Instead, it was one fraught with stigma. The executioner was often considered a necessary evil, yet never fully accepted within polite society. And yet, when the time came for justice to be served, usually in the form of a gruesome public execution, the executioner was called upon to perform his grim task. So what exactly were these tools of death, and what made the executioner both feared and respected? To begin, let's examine the tools of the trade, the instruments of death that the executioner wielded. At the top of this macabre arsenal was the axe, an instrument as simple as it was deadly. The executioner's axe was not just any axe. It was large, heavy, and incredibly sharp, designed for a single purpose: decapitation. With a single well-placed swing, it could end a life instantly, severing the head from the body with surgical precision. The axe was employed for decapitation, a swift yet brutal method of execution. It may seem almost merciful compared to other methods, but don't be fooled by the quickness of the blow. In the hands of an inexperienced executioner, or if the axe was dull or the executioner nervous, a beheading could turn into a bloody and horrifying affair. A single swing was often not enough to sever the head cleanly, causing the condemned to suffer through multiple strikes, each one more excruciating than the last. The stench of blood would fill the air, a visceral reminder of the harshness of life in the Middle Ages. But beheadings weren't always the preferred choice. In some cases, the condemned would be subjected to hanging, which, on the surface, might seem like a less brutal form of execution. However, the truth was far more harrowing. For those condemned to hang, the method was often slow and agonizing, with death coming not through a swift snap of the neck, but through suffocation or a slow strangulation. The medieval crowd was not one to let such an event pass quietly. Spectators would gather to watch, some even cheering, others jeering, all eager for the brutal spectacle to unfold. And then there was the infamous breaking wheel. This particular execution device wasn't just about killing the condemned, it was about public humiliation. The victim would be tied to a large wooden wheel, which would then be lifted high, their body left exposed for all to see. The executioner would break the person's limbs with a blunt instrument, often while the crowd watched in stunned silence. The executioner's goal was not just death, the spectacle of torture the more horrific, the more effective the punishment. It was a form of punishment designed not just to kill, but to terrify the populace into submission. Perhaps the most gruesome and agonizing form of medieval execution was burning at the stake. This was a method reserved for those accused of heresy, witchcraft, or treason. The condemned would be tied to a wooden stake, surrounded by kindling and logs. The flames would be set alight, and the person would burn alive. But unlike a quick execution, burning was a slow, excruciating death. The fire would engulf the body, causing the condemned to writhe in agony as they fought to escape the flames that devoured them. For those unfortunate enough to be sentenced to such a death, the end was not quick nor merciful. It was a long and painful struggle against a fiery, inescapable fate. What makes these executions even more chilling is the fact that they were often carried out in front of large crowds. The medieval public was both spectator and participant, with executions becoming a sort of carnival event. People came from miles around to witness the spectacle, not just to punish the criminal, but to reaffirm their place in a society ruled by fear. The execution wasn't just a method of ending life, it was a ritual, a way to remind the people of the absolute power of the crown, the church, and the state. As we continue our exploration of medieval executions, it's essential to remember that these were not isolated events. They were part of a larger system of control, fear, and intimidation. They were public events designed to assert power, to remind the population of their place in the social order. These executions were not just about punishing the guilty. They were about sending a message that resonated deep into the hearts and minds of everyone who witnessed them. Thanks for watching. In the medieval world, an event like a public execution wasn't just a somber affair. It was practically a pop culture event. Think of the biggest sporting events or concerts you've heard of. It's a kind that gets people hyped for weeks and brings the whole community together. That's exactly the kind of buzz an execution generated. People would come from neighboring towns just to be a part of it. And there were frequent occasions when an execution would be the main talk of the town for days or even weeks before it happened. So what made these events so gripping? Why did people, young, old, high or low, gather in such numbers to watch someone else's demise? It's like going to see a horror movie, except this was real, raw, and in your face. But why would they want to see such a thing? Well, for one, it was a chance to see power in action. The power of the state, the king, the queen, or the church. These weren't just legal proceedings. They were public displays of authority. The condemned was often paraded through the streets before the execution, making sure everyone saw who they were and what they were accused of. This show of force was not lost on the spectators. It was a stark reminder of who was in charge and what would happen if they stepped out of line. But it wasn't just about the politics of it all. There was a morbid fascination at play here too. Death was never a private affair. It was an event for the whole community. In fact, children were often present, watching intently, perhaps learning a valuable lesson about the consequences of bad behavior. It sounds grim, but this was the medieval world we're talking about. Life and death were intertwined in ways we might find disturbing today. Now, the whole spectacle wasn't just about the taking away of life. It was about the manner in which it was taken. If today we think of firing squads or lethal injections, back then the methods were much more theatrical: beheadings, hangings, burnings. You wanted to make sure the message was received loud and clear. These weren't quick, painless methods either. They were designed to make an impact, to be as visible and unforgettable as possible. The crowd wasn't just watching a death, they were witnessing a spectacle. And just like any good show, there was anticipation, tension, even suspense. People would bet on how long the condemned would last, on the method of execution, and even on the reaction of the condemned. All of this added to the excitement, turning what would today be considered a tragic event into something akin to a sporting event. It was almost like people were rooting for their favorite team, albeit a macabre twist on the phrase. Medieval executions weren't just about justice or punishment. They were public events that served multiple purposes. They were a display of power, a warning to others, and yes, a form of entertainment. We might shudder to think of such practices today, but in the context of medieval life, they played a significant role. It was a time when life was harsh, religion was powerful, and society was stratified. Executions were not just a means of punishment, but a tool to maintain order and control. As we look back in history, it's easy to judge the practices of the past. But understanding the social, political, and cultural context of those times helps us see the bigger picture. Medieval executions, while horrifying to our modern sensibilities, were more than just brutal acts. They were a reflection of the values, fears, and societal norms of a bygone era. The Middle Ages were deeply shaped by the Church. The Christian Church was not just a spiritual institution. It was a political powerhouse with significant influence over every aspect of medieval life. In fact, many of the most gruesome executions of the era had the blessing or direct involvement of the Church. In this video, we are going to explore what types of people the Church targeted and why exactly they wanted them dead. Buckle up, because things are about to get bloody. Law enforcement, medieval style. The Church is judge, jury, and executioner. During the Middle Ages, the Church had a big stick when it came to matters of faith and morals. If you questioned Church teachings or committed what they saw as a sin, you might find yourself in hot water, very hot water. Here's how it worked. First, there was the crime. This could be anything from claiming that you didn't need to go to church to having an affair while your spouse was away. Second, there was the investigation. A local priest would look into the matter, and if they found enough evidence, they would take action. Third, there was the punishment. And this is where things got really interesting. Depending on the severity of the crime, the punishment could vary. For smaller sins like stealing a loaf of bread, a priest might forgive you after you repented and made amends with the person you wronged. However, for bigger sins like killing someone or committing adultery, the punishment was much harsher. You would be excommunicated, meaning you were kicked out of the church and banned from participating in any religious ceremonies. Now, this might seem like a spiritual equivalent of a timeout, but in reality, it was a death sentence. Why? Because back then, being part of the church meant being part of the community. You were denied sacraments like baptism and communion, which were necessary for salvation. Being excommunicated was essentially a declaration that you were no longer a member of God's flock. And if you died without making amends, you went straight to hell. It wasn't all about scaring people into good behavior. The church was also very involved in the judicial system. In fact, the phrase God, King, and Country was a common rallying cry during medieval times. Showing how intertwined religion and politics were back then, the church had its own courts which handled cases involving religious laws. And if you were found guilty of a serious offense, you could be put to death. What kind of crimes are we talking about? Well, things like heresy, which meant you had beliefs that went against the teachings of the church, or engaging in harmful activities deemed sinful, such as gambling or having a secret second marriage. Holy injunctions, targeting heretics and witches. As we mentioned earlier, one of the main targets of the church's ire were heretics, people who went against church teachings. Imagine, for example, someone said that the Pope wasn't actually the representative of God on earth, or if they claimed that the Bible had some passages that were wrong. They would have been labeled a heretic and put to death. The church took these matters very seriously. It had special courts called the Inquisition to find and punish heretics. Another group that the church kept a close eye on were those accused of witchcraft. During the Middle Ages, there was a lot of fear surrounding witches. People believed that they made deals with the devil and caused all sorts of problems, from bad weather to illness. If you were accused of witchcraft, your life was pretty much over. You'd be put on trial, and if found guilty, sentenced to death. Often the punishment involved being burned at the stake. Why so gruesome? When you think about the punishments from back then, you can't help but wonder why they had to be so gruesome. After all, weren't these punishments meant to teach people right from wrong? Well, yes. But in the Middle Ages, the line between spiritual and earthly authority was blurred. The king's power was often seen as a gift from God, and if you went against the king or the church, you were seen as an enemy of God. So the punishments were not just a way to make you suffer, were meant to remind you that God and the king were watching. Were also meant to scare other people into following the rules. In a time before widespread literacy, people relied on public spectacles to teach them lessons. And what could be more eye-opening than seeing someone get burned at the stake for practicing witchcraft? These gruesome punishments may seem barbaric today, but they were a common sight in medieval Europe for hundreds of years. As we move further into the dark and gritty world of medieval executions, join us next time as we delve into the horrifying realities of the time. Do not forget to subscribe for more updates and bring a friend for a double dose of historical horror. Together, let's uncover the chilling tales that will leave you saying, "I'm glad I never lived then." Among the many methods of execution in the medieval world, hanging was one of the most common. While it may seem like a less brutal form of execution when compared to burning at the stake or the breaking wheel, it was often far more agonizing than it appeared. Public hangings were not only a means of punishment, they were spectacles that allowed crowds to gather and witness the slow, excruciating death of the condemned. In many cases, these hangings were prolonged, allowing the suffering to drag on for as long as possible, turning what should have been a relatively swift end into a form of public torture. Hanging was often used as a method of execution for criminals, thieves, and those accused of treason. But it was not just the act of hanging that was the spectacle, it was the entire process. The condemned would typically be led to the gallows, a raised platform where the execution would take place. Spectators gathered in large numbers, eager to watch the event unfold. This was a chance for the people to witness justice, or perhaps more accurately, vengeance played out in front of them. The hanging was a public event, one that could involve entire communities. Men, women, and children would gather around the gallows, to witness the punishment of the criminal and to be a part of the collective experience of the town or city. For many, the most gruesome part of a hanging was the slow death that often followed. Contrary to what we might think today, hanging did not always result in a quick and painless death. In some cases, the condemned would struggle for several minutes, suffocating slowly as the noose tightened around their neck. The crowd would watch as the victim writhed and convulsed, struggling to breathe, their body jerking as they hung from the rope. Some would lose consciousness only to wake up again, their lungs gasping for air in a desperate, futile attempt to survive. It was a slow and agonizing death, and the crowd often stayed to watch it all unfold. Some cheering, others jeering, but all eager to witness the victim's final moments. After the condemned had finally expired, the body would remain suspended from the gallows for all to see. This was not done out of mere sadism, but rather it was a necessary measure to ensure that there would be no doubt in anyone's mind that the punishment had been carried out. It was a gruesome spectacle, but one that served as a warning to others who might consider breaking the law. The sight of the dead body swaying in the wind was meant to remind the public of the consequences of their actions. It was a chilling reminder that the price of crime was often death, and the authorities took no prisoners when it came to carrying out the punishment. In some instances, the bodies of those who had been hanged were left on display for even longer, sometimes for days or even weeks. This was particularly common in cases where the person had been accused of a particularly heinous crime, such as murder or treason. The authorities wanted to make sure that the message was received loud and clear, and what better way to do that than to leave the body of the condemned on display for all to see? It was a brutal and barbaric practice, but it was a necessary evil in the eyes of the law. During the medieval period, the threat of public execution by hanging was enough to keep most people in line. The fear of being locked up in prison and then having their life snuffed out in front of a jeering crowd was a powerful deterrent to crime. Even the possibility of being executed in such a public and humiliating manner was enough to strike fear into the hearts of many. As society evolved and our understanding of justice and human rights grew, the use of public executions began to decline. Today, we look back at these practices and shudder at the thought of such cruelty and public displays of violence. But during the Middle Ages, hanging was just one of the many tools used to maintain order and enforce the laws of society, whether we condone it or not. From the very beginning, man has invented different ways to punish wrongdoers. Over the years, many methods have been used, from the most bizarre to the cruelest. Today, we'll take a look at one of the most painful and terrifying methods of medieval execution: burning at the stake. All the horrible ways a person can die, burning to death is surely one of the worst. And when it's done slowly and publicly, it becomes even more horrific. Burning at the stake was reserved for the most heinous crimes: heresy, witchcraft, and sometimes even treason. It was considered not only a punishment, but a kind of divine purification, a way to cleanse the sinner and restore balance to the world. In the Middle Ages, the procedure for burning at the stake was both meticulous and agonizing. The condemned was usually tied to a wooden stake that was planted firmly in the ground. The victim's hands were tied behind their back, and in some cases, their feet were also bound. A rope was also looped around their neck, ready to tighten as the fire grew. This ensured that the condemned would be held securely and wouldn't collapse as the fire took hold. Once secured, the condemned was left amidst an ever-growing pile of wood and kindling that would soon become their pyre. As the executioner approached with a torch or red-hot musket ball, the crowd would fall silent, anticipating the gruesome spectacle about to unfold. When the kindling was ignited, the flames would begin their relentless creep up the stake. At first, the fire would merely singe the exposed skin and clothing of the victim. But as the logs beneath the kindling began to burn, the heat would intensify. The air around the stake would quickly become stifling, and the smell of burning flesh would start to waft over the crowd. As the fire reached the victim's clothing, it would either char or ignite the fabric, causing the flames to spread even faster. If the victim wasn't already dead, the heat would quickly render them unconscious. But even at this point, the agony wasn't over. The fire would continue to scorch their flesh, turning it first red, then black and blistered. For those who didn't die instantly, the fire would continue to burn and char the flesh until every part of their body had been affected. Throughout this ordeal, the condemned might cry out in pain and anguish, their screams echoing over the crowd. However, the noise of the roaring fire and the murmurs of the crowd would often drown out their cries. Some accounts also mention that during the execution, A friar might approach the stake and ask the victim to confess their sins and seek forgiveness. If the victim agreed, they would have a chance to repent and perhaps lessen their punishment. But this was often a formality, and the confession did little to alter the gruesome fate that awaited them. The execution wasn't over until every part of the condemned's body had been burned away. Sometimes the fire would be allowed to die down overnight. The next day, the executioner would prod the smoldering remains with a pike or sword to ensure every part of the body had been consumed. Nothing was supposed to remain of the victim but ashes. Any part of the unburnt body, such as a hand or foot, would be seen as an omen of the devil's interference. What makes the burning at the stake even more horrifying is that it was often done in public. People from all walks of life would gather to watch this spectacle, which served not only as a warning to the condemned, but also as a reminder to others of what they might face if they stepped out of line. The crowd would often cheer and jeer throughout the execution, showing little sympathy for the suffering of the victim. For many, it was a day of public entertainment. Today, the thought of burning someone at the stake is beyond barbaric. It's considered a war crime and a grave violation of human rights. But in the past, it was a common punishment for crimes against the state or the church. During the Salem witch trials in the 17th century, several women were burned at the stake after being convicted of witchcraft. Similarly, during the religious persecutions of the early Christians, many were also burned to death for their beliefs. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about similar topics, please check out our other content. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more informative content like this. One of the most brutal and agonizing methods of execution in medieval times was the breaking wheel, a device so horrifying that it strikes fear into the hearts of anyone who hears about it today. This was not simply an execution method, it was a public torture ritual that could last for hours, a display of physical agony, meant to humiliate the condemned and serve as a warning to all who might consider defying the law. Unlike the beheading or hanging, which could be over relatively quickly, though still painfully so, the broken wheel ensured prolonged suffering that the crowd would witness in all its gruesome detail. In this episode, we will explore the horrific details of this medieval torture device and the excruciating ordeal it inflicted upon its victims. Join us as we delve into the dark history of the breaking wheel and uncover the terrifying truth behind one of the most brutal forms of punishment ever devised. The breaking wheel was a medieval torture device and method of execution that involved the systematic breaking of the condemned person's limbs. It was used primarily during the late Middle Ages, from the 14th to 17th centuries, throughout Europe, as well as in other parts of the world, including ancient Rome and medieval Japan. The device consisted of a large, typically wooden wheel on which the condemned person was tied, and their limbs were broken one by one, using a blunt instrument such as a hammer or a mallet. The use of the breaking wheel was widespread during the Middle Ages, and it was employed for various crimes, including murder, rape, robbery, and heresy. The condemned person would first be stripped naked and tied to the wheel with ropes or chains. A heavy cloth or leather pad was often placed over the person's chest to protect their heart, as it was believed that breaking the bones of the limbs would cause the heart to stop beating. The executioner would then begin the process of breaking the limbs, starting with the arms and legs, using a blunt instrument such as a hammer or a pole. The goal was to break the bones in such a way that the person could not escape or move, ensuring that they remained completely helpless and at the mercy of their tormentors. Once the limbs had been broken, the victim's body would often be left on the wheel, which could be raised into the air, leaving the person exposed for all to see. The public nature of this execution was an essential part of its terror. It wasn't just the victim's suffering that mattered, but the spectacle of the suffering body that would haunt the minds of the onlookers long after the event. The pain caused by the broken wheel was immense, but the horror didn't end there. After the victim's limbs were broken, they would often be left on the wheel to die, their broken bodies exposed to the elements. The torture of the broken wheel could last for hours, sometimes days, as the condemned lingered in a state of agony, unable to escape. The executioner might also break the victim's spine or ribs, leaving them even more vulnerable. In some cases, the condemned would be left on display for days after death. The body exposed to the elements, a grotesque reminder of the consequences of disobedience. But the use of the wheel was not just about breaking the body, it was about breaking the spirit. The slow, torturous process of execution was designed to humiliate the condemned, to strip them of their dignity, and to leave them vulnerable to public scorn. The medieval world had little sympathy for those who broke the laws of the land. And the broken wheel was a powerful reminder of what could happen to those who defied the state. Today, the broken wheel stands as a chilling reminder of the depths of human cruelty and the lengths to which society would go to inflict pain and suffering on those who dared to defy its laws. It's a testament to a time when the line between justice and vengeance was blurred. The punishment often exceeded the crime. The medieval world was a brutal and unforgiving place, and the broken wheel was a symbol of that brutality. It was a reminder that, in that time and place, the price of disobedience could be nothing less than the destruction of the body and the soul. Hey guys, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe for more historical tales. And if you want to support us, you can check out our support page. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Medieval life was rough, and if you were unfortunate enough to find yourself on the wrong side of the law, your punishment could be swift, brutal, and very public. Now, while we think of medieval times as a period dominated by kings and queens, dukes and lords, life for these nobles wasn't always as glamorous as it sounds. They, too, could find themselves in the dreaded dock, facing charges that could end in the ultimate punishment, execution. You see, being part of the nobility didn't necessarily mean you had a cushy, untouchable existence. In fact, it came with its own set of risks and challenges. Unlike commoners, nobles often had greater resources, which meant their punishments tended to be more severe when they did break the law. And the methods of execution for nobles were often more dramatic, more symbolic, and perhaps more telling of the political power struggles of the time. One of the most famous examples of a noble's execution was the execution of Lady Jane Grey. She was just 17 years old, and she found herself at the center of a political storm in 1553, when Lady Jane Grey's father fell out of favor with King Edward VI. He was executed, leaving his daughter caught in the crossfire. Despite her young age, Lady Jane Grey was thrust into a position of power and became the Lady Regent of England for 9 days, but her claim to the throne was short-lived. At the order of the now-restored Queen Mary I, Lady Jane Grey and her father's family were thrown into the Tower of London, charged with high treason. Despite her innocence, Lady Jane Grey was sentenced to death. Her execution was a brutal affair, meant to send a clear message of Queen Mary's absolute authority. Lady Jane Grey was executed by sword, not the customary axe, which was more common for commoners. As the executioner approached, she bravely placed her head on the block and awaited her fate. But even in her final moments, she displayed courage and grace. According to legend, when the executioner hesitated, believing her collar to be too stiff to allow for a clean strike, she nodded her head to encourage him to carry out her sentence swiftly and with certainty. The execution of Marie Antoinette in 1793 during the French Nassau Revolution was another instance of how the execution of a noble wasn't just a punishment, and it was a spectacle, a warning, and a statement. Marie Antoinette, the last queen of France before the Revolution, was a controversial figure. She was seen by many as a symbol of the extravagance and excess of the French monarchy, a monarchy that was increasingly out of touch with the struggles of the common people. As the revolution gathered momentum, Marie Antoinette and her husband, King Louis XVI, found themselves at the center of a maelstrom of political and social upheaval. Ultimately, both were charged with treason and found guilty. Their executions were as dramatic as they were brutal. Marie Antoinette was executed by guillotine, a relatively new and more humane method of execution at the time. As she stepped onto the platform, she showed remarkable composure, displaying a level of dignity that belied the chaos that surrounded her. The revolutionary fervor of the time ensured that the details of her execution were known throughout the kingdom. Her death sent shockwaves across Europe, signaling a definitive break with the old order. In both the cases of Lady Jane Grey and Marie Antoinette, as well as many other nobles executed during the period, their executions were not just about punishing individuals. They were about making a statement. The execution of a king, queen, or noble was a public spectacle that often held significant political weight, marking the fall of an era or the shifting of power. The message sent through their demise was clear. No one, regardless of birth or status, was above the law. And the means by which they lost their lives were often as dramatic and symbolic as their titles. From the sword that took Lady Jane Grey's life to the guillotine that claimed Marie Antoinette's head, each method served as a reminder of the fragility of power and the ruthlessness of those who wielded it. Looking back, these executions serve as stark reminders of a time when power was highly concentrated and the means of its transference were often violent and public. They offer a glimpse into a world where the line between privilege and peril was often a thin one. Medieval times was a brutal period in history, and its cruelty knew no bounds. From the scorching fires of the Inquisition to the gruesome spectacles of public executions, the medieval world was a terrifying place to live. And today, we will delve into the darkest depths of this era and explore the horrifying ways in which people were put to death in medieval times. Welcome to my channel. And before we begin, remember to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an exciting episode. One of the most common forms of capital punishment during the Middle Ages was burning at the stake. This horrific practice was used to punish those who were accused of heresy, witchcraft, or other crimes against the state or the church. The victims were usually tied to a stake and then set ablaze, with some reports indicating that the fires were so intense that the victims were literally roasted alive. Imagine the searing pain of your skin being burned, the agonizing feeling of your muscles and organs being cooked from the inside out. The burning at the stake was a terrifying ordeal that was meant to serve as a warning to others who might consider challenging the authority of the state or the church. Another common form of execution during the Middle Ages was hanging. This method was often used to punish criminals or those who had been convicted of serious crimes such as murder or treason. The condemned were hanged by a noose around their neck until they suffocated or died of a broken neck. Picture the agonizing pain of your neck being twisted at an unnatural angle, the feeling of your bones cracking and breaking as you struggle to breathe. Hanging was a brutal and agonizing way to die that was meant to be a warning to others not to break the law. In addition to burning at the stake and hanging, medieval society also employed a variety of other methods of capital punishment. These included beheading, which was often used to punish high-ranking members of society, and crucifixion, which was used to punish those who were accused of serious crimes against the church or the state. One particularly gruesome form of execution that was used during the Middle Ages was the breaking wheel. This involved tying the victim to a large wooden wheel and then beating them with clubs or other blunt objects until they were completely broken and paralyzed. Can you imagine the excruciating pain of being beaten over and over again? The sickening crunch of your bones being broken as you cry out for mercy? The breaking wheel was a horrific and agonizing way to die that was meant to terrify and deter others from committing crimes. These are just a few of the many ways that people were put to death in medieval times. It's important to note that these executions were not only brutal and horrifying, but they were also public events that were meant to serve as warnings to the general population. During the Middle Ages, the punishment for a crime was not only meant to be severe, but also to be a spectacle that would remind people of the consequences of wrongdoing. Today we live in a world where capital punishment is rare, and most countries have abolished the death penalty altogether. However, it's important to remember that these practices were common and accepted during the Middle Ages, and it was until relatively recently that we began to question the use of such brutal and inhumane forms of punishment. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and share it with your friends. Remember to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our awesome historical tales. And if you have any suggestions for future videos, let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Now you need to watch what really killed Ivan the Terrible, or check out this video instead. Now we're going to talk about something that might upset some viewers, so viewer discretion is advised. As we close this dark chapter on medieval executions, one thing becomes clear. The way justice was dispensed in this era was nothing like the systems of fairness we strive for today. The gruesome methods, beheadings, burnings at the stake, and agonizing tortures on wheels were not merely acts of vengeance, but chilling public spectacles designed to control and manipulate. The medieval world, bound by superstition, political intrigue, and the ever-present threat of violence, saw execution not as a grim necessity, but as a tool of societal cohesion. Fear, rather than law, governed the minds of the people. But these public executions were just the beginning. They were part of a larger system of brutality that permeated the medieval justice system. While death may have been the ultimate punishment, there were other forms of torment that could break a person's spirit long before their final breath. Torture devices designed to extract confessions, enforce submission, and maintain control were just as much a part of the medieval world as executions. The terrifying contraptions used to cause pain and suffering in the name of law and order serve as a testament to the cruelty of the times. And while we may think of these devices as relics of the past, their horrifying legacy reminds us that humans, when driven by fear and power, can create unimaginable devices to impose control and extract obedience. In modern times, we look back at these methods with disbelief, not just because of their barbarity, but because they reveal a side of humanity that, thankfully, most societies have long outgrown. Yet as history shows us, the capacity for cruelty has always been there, lurking beneath the surface. The medieval era's brutal punishments may have been a thing of the past, but the harshness of power dynamics and the capacity for violence in the name of justice still lurks in the dark corners of human history. These acts, while horrific, are part of the story we must never forget. For it is through understanding the depths of human cruelty that we learn the importance of mercy, fairness, and the dignity of human life. But the reality of medieval punishment goes beyond the spectacle of public executions. It delves into the dark world of medieval torture, where the objective was not just to punish, but to inflict pain, suffering, and humiliation. At the heart of this dark system were torture devices, instruments of agony designed to extract confessions, enforce compliance, and most importantly, to terrify and subdue. Imagine being trapped in a medieval dungeon, the air thick with the smell of stale waste and decay. The flickering torch casts long, dancing shadows on the wall, revealing glimpses of instruments of torture, each one more terrifying than the last. As the door creaks open, you find yourself face to face with your executioner, his expression a mask of grim determination. Your fate, whatever he chooses it to be, is sealed. We are going to explore the intricate world of medieval torture devices. What were these instruments of pain really used for? How did they function, and what horrors did they inflict upon their victims? Join us as we peel back the layers of medieval justice, exposing the truth behind these instruments of agony. Medieval torture devices were more than just instruments of punishment. They were tools of terror. Let's start with the rack. This device was used to stretch and twist the body, causing excruciating pain and often permanent injury. The victim would be tied to a wooden board with ropes or chains, and then the rack would slowly begin to extend, pulling and stretching the limbs. The Iron Maiden, on the other hand, was a metal cabinet with spikes on the inside. The victim, usually tied up, was locked inside and left to die slowly from the pain inflicted by the spikes. Then we have the Judas cradle, a triangular frame with a hole for the head and spikes around the opening. The victim's head would be placed in the hole and spikes would be inserted into the ears, nose, and eyes, causing unimaginable pain and torment. Each of these devices had its own horrifying purpose, and they were employed without any hesitation to extract confessions, punish perceived crimes, and deter others from following the victim's path. These devices were not just used on prisoners awaiting execution, but also on suspected witches and heretics. They were a means to break the human spirit, to bend it to the will of the torturers. The use of such brutal devices raises questions about the nature of power and control. Why were these methods deemed necessary? What did they achieve, and how did they reflect the values and beliefs of the time? To answer these questions, we must delve deeper into the socio-political context of medieval Europe.